Lecture 21, The Daoist Response to Confucianism.
In this lecture, we're going to be considering the Daoists. And so the first order of business is to address who the Daoists actually were. I've so far said a little bit about the Daoists as being thinkers who tend to focus on the way that everything in the world is interconnected, that there's a kind of fundamental flux in which energies flow, and we're all part of that. But as far as specifying what the Daoists believed, there are a few problems. One problem is that sometimes the word was used mainly to distinguish some people from Confucians. This was particularly true when Confucians held power in the government. There were the orthodox people, the Confucians, and then there were the others, the Daoists. It would be a little bit like thinking of all the unorthodox people you know. Well, they may have some things in common, but what they mostly have in common is what they're not. There's also a tendency to distinguish two different kinds of Taoism. I think a tendency that's overemphasized. This tendency is to talk about religious Taoists as opposed to philosophical Taoists. To say a little bit more about that distinction, I should mention one of the earliest figures who is linked to the Taoist school of thought, a person named Yang Chu. Yang Chu is known in Chinese thought as an egoist, which is fairly rare, actually. I was mentioning in a previous lecture that the Chinese tend to focus on the relations that everyone has to other people in particular, but also nature as well. So the fact that Yang Chu is rather egoistic is rather striking. Particularly, Yang Chu argues that there's nothing more valuable than life itself. So he doesn't think it's worthwhile to expend your energy doing things that actually risk your life. The Confucians in particular thought this was really abhorrent. If there aren't things that you would risk your life for or put yourself out for, in their opinion, you're really falling down on your ethical responsibilities. But Yang Chu's emphasis was on maintaining your health, maintaining your vitality. And this does tend to be a kind of continuing theme in Taoism, even though very few people would go as far as Yang Chu in pushing it. So the difference that's sometimes made between philosophical and religious Taoists has to do with in what sense you are protecting your life or protecting your vitality. There was a long emphasis in China on various ways to extend your life in a very practical sense. Certainly emperors sometimes were specialists in hiring people to help them learn how to live longer. Perhaps some of these potions and things that were taken actually had just the opposite effect of their intention. But the idea was if you could figure out some ways of using things in nature to help you continue your life and make it thrive, to maintain your vitality, so much the better. On the other hand, because death does seem to be a part of life, some of the more philosophical Taoists tend to reflect on the fact that we're all part of this continuing flux that is everything. So what's really important or fundamental about us continues with the flow of nature. And on the surface, those seem to be somewhat opposite goals, trying to live as long as you possibly can as an individual versus viewing yourself as part of the whole, and therefore your individual life and death isn't it's so extremely important. In fact, I think a lot of people tended to see both of those as reasonable goals. Not too many people were in any position to go as far as Emperor Qin Shi Huangdi, for example, who actually sent an expedition out to look for the Western paradise. Paradise was viewed as somehow in the West, and so he thought, well, if I just send a delegation, maybe this will improve my relationship or my chances for paradise. But at the same time, he was trying to extend his life as long as he possibly could. On the other hand, a lot of people may have thought, well, to extend your life, but being human beings, being mortal, of course we are part of the flow. So this is something to take solace in after we die or when people near us die. There are two texts that I'm going to be referring to in this lecture. And these two texts are really important texts in Taoism. But some of the tensions that occur between, for example, the goal of trying to live individually as long as you can versus seeing yourself as part of the whole, or trying to protect your health as much as you can versus allowing yourself to go with the flow of nature, These appear in both within each of these texts and sometimes between them. The first of these is fairly well known, at least by its title in the West. This is the Tao Te Ching. It's also referred to as the Lao Tzu because it's attributed to a sage called Lao Tzu who lived in the 6th century BCE. There is an individual named Lao Tzu that historians have associated this text with, though there may be some question as to whether or not Lao Tzu actually wrote most of it. But another thing that's particularly pleasing, I think, to the Taoists in particular, is the fact that Lao Tzu in translation means old master. So in a sense, these are very sagely teachings that come to us from antiquity. The second of these texts is a work called the Zhuangzi, after the person who wrote it. Zhuangzi is a great writer. And one of the things that's remarkable about this text is how stories, particularly humorous stories, are used to make philosophical points. In general, and it's very hard to summarize this book, one of the things that does seem to be a consistent theme is the stories are always trying to defy our expectations. So if you expect someone in a position of authority to be able to speak with authority, maybe that's going to be just the opposite of what happens here. Sometimes people that are characterized as complete losers end up speaking great wisdom. At one point, the fact that someone who has had quite a lot to drink rolls out of a cart and doesn't injure himself because he's so supple is praised. Things like that that just normally don't seem to be the kind of image of how you'd want people to live or role models for everyone to emulate. These tend to be what Zhuangzi excels in. Now, part of the point of this is that the Taoists in general, as a school, insofar as you can call it a school, were critical of Confucianism, and particularly the emphasis on certain kinds of rituals or playing certain well-established or scripted parts. Their idea was that there's too much emphasis in Confucianism on traditional ways of doing things and too little on one's inner nature. Now, as I mentioned when I talked about Confucius, Confucius would certainly deny that what he was trying to do is encourage people to go through the motions of playing out a role, taking certain vows, carrying out a ceremony without the feeling behind it. But the Taoists think that there's always going to be a discrepancy between something that is already pre-given as a role or a script and your inner feeling. They think the best way to interact with other human beings is not through social vocabulary of rituals that have been well established over time. Instead, they think what we should do is allow our inner nature to express itself as directly as possible and choose its own means for doing that. So in general, what they would view as Confucian overemphasis on ritual, they would say is just really the trappings of socialization. We're socialized to do certain kinds of things. We do these habitually, but these are really not the best way for human beings to really come together as minds and hearts. For this reason, they tend to place a lot less emphasis than the Confucians do on political office. The Confucians, as I mentioned, certainly think that you can play an important role in government whether you're in political office or not. But nevertheless, the emphasis is often on social harmony and having the right person in the right place within the government and so on. The Taoists tend to think that a lot of effort is placed on trying to get into the right position, and people spend their lives in one position trying to get into another position. So much energy, so much effort, so much frustration goes into these efforts. All this vitality is being wasted. So again, the idea of conserving your vitality, allowing your vitality to work spontaneously and not with these kind of long-term projects of improving your office, getting more influence, and so on. This tends to be a very dominant influence among the Taoists, or sorry, a dominant theme with the Taoists. In general, the Taoists tend to think that much of life, for most people, is spent trying too hard to do things that seem a little bit foreign to their nature. I think of situations where people are first dating, and the kind of effort people make to be attractive to members of the opposite sex. And the sort of feeling one has if you notice children, I would call them children, teenagers dating when they're trying so hard to impress each other, and they'd probably like each other so much better if they just stopped trying.